By January 1945, the Netherlands had become a graveyard of silence. The rivers had frozen over, the fields lay dead beneath layers of gray ice, and the last trains carried only the desperate and the dying. In the cities, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Utrecht, people burned their furniture for warmth. Families traded wedding rings for potatoes, or scraped the flour dust from mill floors to bake something resembling bread. For the Vandermeer family, the war had reduced life to a single room. Hendrik, the father, had been a teacher once, before the schools closed. His wife, Elise, rationed the last of their beet syrup to keep their 2 children alive, little Lotte, aged 7, and Bram, just 5. Both had the hollow eyes of hunger that no parent should ever have to see. The Germans still occupied much of the western Netherlands, even as the Allies pushed closer. Rumors spread that food drops might come soon, that the Americans were near. But to those who hadn't eaten properly in weeks, hope itself felt like a cruel joke. One morning, Hendrik woke to a sound he hadn't heard in months, an airplane. He stumbled outside into the freezing wind, half expecting bombs. But what fell from the gray sky wasn't death. It was food. Boxes, real boxes, floating down on parachutes, bursting open on the frozen fields beyond the town. The first to reach them were children. They clawed at the snow with bare hands, finding tins of biscuits, bags of flour, and chocolate wrapped in silver paper. Elise ran to them, screaming their names, her heart pounding. Bram held up a can of milk powder like treasure. And as she pulled her children close, Hendrik fell to his knees in the snow, not from exhaustion, but from the unbearable relief of it all. For the first time in months, the sound of laughter returned to their street. But none of them yet knew that soon, the Americans themselves would arrive, and what they would do next would change how the Dutch saw their liberators forever. 2 days after the food drops, the distant rumble of engines came from the east. The townspeople, gaunt and weary, gathered by the road. Through the haze of snow, they saw olive-drab trucks rolling toward them, American convoy markings painted on their sides, stars faded but visible beneath the dirt and frost. Hendrik held Lotte's hand as they watched the first truck stop at the square. Soldiers jumped down, young men, most barely older than his former students, their faces pink from the cold. They smiled awkwardly at the silent Dutch crowd, unsure whether to salute, wave, or simply unload the crates. One of them, a tall soldier with dark hair and a kind, tired face, noticed the children staring. He reached into a pocket and pulled out a chocolate bar. The wrapper gleamed like something out of a dream. "For you," he said softly, in broken Dutch, handing it to Lotte. She didn't move. Her mother whispered, "Take it, liefje," her voice trembling. Lotte did, and when she tasted the first piece, she started to cry. Not loud sobs, just small, choking tears, as though her body didn't know how to process joy anymore. The soldier knelt beside her. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe now." Behind him, the Americans opened the truck's back. Out came sacks of flour, crates of tinned meat, powdered eggs, condensed milk, even barrels of fuel for stoves. The villagers swarmed to help, their movements unsteady, weak from months of deprivation. An elderly man crossed himself. Another woman knelt and kissed the soldier's hand. The Americans seemed stunned by the reaction. They'd seen suffering before, but not like this. Not children who weighed less than their rifles. Elise clutched Bram to her chest as she whispered, "They're feeding us before themselves." For she had noticed, the soldiers hadn't eaten since dawn, yet every can they opened, every loaf they baked in makeshift ovens, they gave away first. When night fell, the town square glowed with firelight for the first time that winter. Bread baked. Soup simmered. And from somewhere in the crowd, a voice, shaky, cracked, began to sing the Dutch national anthem. The soldiers stood silent, their breath clouding in the air. Then one of them whispered, "That's what home sounds like." The next morning, a hush lingered over the town. The Americans had slept in their trucks, refusing to take the few remaining homes with working stoves. Before dawn, they began cooking again, thick oatmeal from army rations, steaming in metal pots over makeshift fires. The smell drifted through the streets like something out of memory. When they invited the children to eat, the first few stepped forward cautiously. Years of scarcity had reshaped their instincts. They didn't rush toward food anymore. They looked first to their parents, waiting for a nod, a sign that it was safe. A medic, Corporal Reeves, crouched down beside a little boy whose ribs showed through his shirt. He offered him a tin cup filled with warm oatmeal. The boy, maybe 6, took a spoonful and froze. His throat wouldn't move. Reeves looked confused, until Hendrik explained softly. "They've forgotten what it feels like to eat too much." So the soldiers learned to feed them slowly, carefully. A few spoonfuls at a time. They mixed water with milk to ease their stomachs. They broke bread into small pieces and soaked it in broth. For hours, the square became a silent communion, the sound of spoons tapping tin, of breaths held between bites. Elise stood beside Reeves, helping distribute food. She had been a nurse before the occupation, before the hospitals ran out of supplies. Now, with trembling hands, she found herself treating the same symptoms she had once studied in textbooks: malnutrition, edema, anemia. But these weren't patients in a hospital ward. These were her neighbors. One girl, no older than Lotte, tried to save half her ration, wrapping it carefully in a scrap of cloth. When Reeves told her she could eat it all, she shook her head. "For my brother," she whispered. He was gone, Elise realized, likely dead during the hunger winter. But the instinct to share, to care for someone who no longer existed, remained. By midday, a different sound filled the square, children laughing. Weak laughter, yes, but laughter nonetheless. Soldiers looked at one another, some smiling, some blinking hard against tears. Reeves muttered, "I've patched up men at the Bulge, seen hell itself, but I never thought saving lives would sound like this." And from the rooftops, Hendrik watched the sun break through the gray, its light falling across the soldiers and villagers alike. Two worlds, divided by war, momentarily joined by bread and mercy. By the third day, the Americans had set up a proper field kitchen near the canal. Smoke rose from the chimneys of salvaged oil drums, and the smell of stew carried through the town like a promise. The soldiers called it Operation Chow Line, half-jokingly, but for the Dutch it felt like the resurrection of life itself. Women began to emerge from cellars and barns, drawn by the aroma. They carried chipped bowls, dented pans, even helmets to fill with soup. The line stretched along the street, silent but orderly, as though every person feared that speaking might break the fragile spell. Sergeant Miller, a farm boy from Kansas, stirred one of the great pots, sweat beading his brow. When a woman approached with 2 small children, he smiled and ladled stew into their bowl. "There's plenty," he said. But she hesitated. "Only for them," she whispered. Miller frowned. "Ma'am, you eat too." She shook her head, clutching her scarf tighter. "Mothers eat last," she said in broken English. Miller's hand trembled slightly as he filled a second bowl and set it beside her. "Not today," he replied. "Today, everyone eats first." Nearby, a soldier played an old accordion someone had found in the ruins. The melody, faint, uneven, drifted through the cold air. It wasn't a victory tune nor a hymn. Just a quiet song that reminded everyone of something before the war. A lullaby, perhaps. The Dutch civilians began sharing what little they still had: onions, beets, stale bread softened in water. A kind of communion took shape, unplanned but sacred. Elise moved among the children, checking pulses, wiping mouths, laughing softly as if she'd forgotten how. And then, unexpectedly, a child began to cry, not from hunger or fear, but because he couldn't finish his bowl. His stomach, after years of emptiness, had given up before his will. Elise knelt and hugged him, whispering, "It's all right. There will be more tomorrow." Those words, "there will be more tomorrow," spread like fire through the crowd. Someone repeated them aloud in Dutch, then in English. Soldiers nodded. Mothers began to weep. It was the first time in months anyone had believed in tomorrow. Later that evening, as the fires dimmed and the last bowls were cleaned, Miller looked out over the canal. The sun was setting behind the church steeple, painting the broken roofs in red and gold. "I guess," he murmured, "this is what winning really looks like." At dawn, trucks began arriving from the coast, American supply convoys escorted by military police. The canvas tarps were marked with red crosses and the words Relief, UNRRA. When the soldiers pulled them open, what spilled out wasn't ammunition or uniforms, but sacks of flour, tins of condensed milk, boxes of vitamins, and bread still warm from the portable ovens aboard the ships. The Dutch gathered around in stunned silence. The scent of yeast and butter filled the air, a smell almost forgotten. Elise watched an elderly man fall to his knees beside one of the crates. He touched a loaf gently, as if afraid it might vanish. "Bread," he whispered. "Real bread." The Americans didn't distribute it like ration masters. They handed it out by the armful, laughing, calling to the children, tossing apples through the air. One soldier balanced loaves on his helmet like a clown, making the younger ones giggle for the first time in months. But not everyone accepted so easily. A local man named Peter, once a schoolteacher, stood back with folded arms. "They bombed our city," he muttered. "Now they feed us?" His bitterness was understandable. His wife had died when a stray Allied plane hit the bakery she was queuing in. Elise heard him and said softly, "Yes, they did. But they also stopped the men who would have starved us all." Peter said nothing, but when a little girl tugged at his coat with a piece of bread half-eaten and offered him the rest, his eyes softened. He took it and whispered a single word. "Dank J." The Americans didn't fully understand the language, but they understood the tone. They could see it in the trembling hands reaching for food, in the smiles breaking through exhaustion. That evening, Elise helped the medics hand out vitamin syrup to the children. A boy named Jan, no older than 7, grinned after his first spoonful. "It tastes like summer," he said. Elise laughed, the sound strange and bright in her own ears. When night fell, she sat with Sergeant Miller by the fire, watching villagers and soldiers share stories. "You've saved them," she said. Miller shook his head. "No," he replied. "We just reminded them what full feels like." For a brief moment, surrounded by the warmth of soup and laughter, the war felt distant, like a nightmare fading with the dawn. The next morning, a heavy fog rolled in from the river, wrapping the town in a gray stillness. The Americans had planned to move on within days. There were other towns, other starving mouths to feed. But as word spread that they might leave soon, the Dutch grew restless, as if afraid the fog itself would swallow up this fragile peace once the soldiers were gone. Elise found herself drawn to a small girl who lingered near the makeshift kitchen every day. She couldn't have been more than 8. Her face was pale and thin, but her eyes were alert, too alert, like a cat that's survived one too many storms. Around her neck she wore a bright blue scarf, a patch of color against the ruin. "What is Jainam?" Elise asked softly. The girl hesitated, clutching the scarf. "Anneliese," she whispered. Elise smiled. "A lovely name. You should eat, Anneliese." "I'm not hungry," the girl replied. But Elise saw her eyes dart toward a soldier slicing bread, her throat twitching with every movement of the knife. So she broke off a piece herself and offered it gently. The girl took it, almost guiltily, then ate it so slowly it hurt to watch, as though trying to memorize each bite. Later, Elise saw Anneliese standing by Sergeant Miller, tugging at his sleeve. He bent down, and she pressed the blue scarf into his hand. "You gave us soup," she said in halting English. "Now you keep warm." Miller froze, then knelt. "No, sweetheart, you need this." But the girl shook her head stubbornly. "Mama says gifts must go both ways." For a long moment Miller didn't speak. He simply nodded, wrapping the scarf around his wrist like a ribbon. "Then I'll keep it," he said quietly. "For luck." That evening, Elise found him staring into the campfire, running the scarf between his fingers. "You think she'll be all right?" he asked. "She's already survived everything," Elise said. "She'll be fine." But neither of them quite believed it. In war, even hope felt fragile, like glass held too tightly in trembling hands. Still, As the fog thinned and the stars emerged, the little blue scarf fluttered softly in the breeze. A thread of color against the night, a small proof that humanity could still exist amid ruin. 2 days later, the first flakes of snow began to fall. It wasn't much, a faint dusting, almost shy, but for the Dutch, it carried an eerie echo. The last snow they had seen had brought hunger and death. It had meant sealed cellars, frozen canals, and children buried in the frost. But now, it fell over steaming pots and laughter, over soldiers and civilians sharing bread beneath the same gray sky. Elise watched the flakes melt on her gloves, feeling the strange collision of old fear and new warmth. Around her, soldiers worked quietly, loading supplies into trucks bound for nearby villages. Each crate bore the stenciled mark U.S. Army Relief. Some men joked and sang, but their voices were subdued, careful, as if they knew how fragile the moment was. Anneliese ran through the falling snow, laughing as she caught flakes on her tongue. Her mother, a thin woman with hollow cheeks, stood beside Elise. "She hasn't laughed since my husband was taken," the woman said softly. "The soldiers, they remind her what fathers sound like." Elise nodded. "They remind all of us." That afternoon, Miller gathered the children by the fire. "Back home," he said, "we build snowmen when it starts snowing. Big ones, with hats and scarves." The children stared, unsure. So he rolled the first ball himself, grunting dramatically until laughter broke out. Soon the Dutch kids joined in, pushing snow with their thin hands while the Americans added buttons, twigs, and bits of tin for eyes. When they finished, a crooked snowman stood in the square, wearing an old army helmet and holding a spoon like a rifle. The children erupted in laughter, laughter that echoed down the empty streets, bouncing off the stone walls that had heard only weeping for years. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elise looked at the snowman, at the fires, at the soldiers huddled with the townspeople. "Do you think they'll remember this?" she asked. Miller glanced at her, his breath misting in the cold. "I hope they forget it," he said quietly. "I hope someday, it's just another winter. Not the winter they were starving." Elise nodded slowly. "Maybe," she whispered, "but I think they'll remember the ones who fed them." The snow thickened that night, covering the ruins like a clean sheet, not erasing the scars, but softening them, just enough for sleep. By the end of the week, the Americans received orders to move out. The main front had shifted east, and their units were needed closer to the German border. Word spread quickly through the town, first as rumor, then as certainty. The Dutch villagers gathered in small, anxious clusters, watching as the trucks were loaded again. The air that morning was heavy with unspoken things. Children clung to the soldiers' legs, refusing to let go. Women pressed flowers, real or paper, into their hands. One elderly man removed his hat and bowed, a gesture so deliberate and slow it brought tears to the American's eyes. Elise found herself unable to speak as she packed the medical supplies. She had grown used to the rhythm of this fragile coexistence. Americans with their strange drawls and constant jokes, Dutch civilians rediscovering life, laughter, and color. To see them go felt like losing a light she didn't know she needed. Sergeant Miller walked up beside her, adjusting his pack. The blue scarf Anneliese had given him still hung from his wrist. "You'll stay here, right?" he asked. "Yes," she said softly. "There are still sick people. Still wounds that don't show." Miller nodded. "There always are." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tin of chocolate, the last one from his rations. "For Anneliese," he said. "Tell her it's from Santa." Elise smiled. "She'll think you're Santa. Then tell her he went back to America," he said with a grin, though his eyes looked distant. When the trucks finally rolled out, the villagers lined the road. No trumpets, no flags, just quiet gratitude. Elise stood with Anneliese, who waved her tiny hand until the last vehicle vanished into the white horizon. Only then did she lower her arm and whisper, "They'll come back, won't they?" Elise knelt beside her, brushing snow from her hair. "Maybe not them," she said gently. "But someone like them." Anneliese nodded, clutching the tin of chocolate to her chest. She looked up at the sky, where the falling snow had turned to light. "Then we'll keep the fire ready," she said. And in that frozen Dutch town, once starved, now reborn, the people did just that. They kept the fire ready, not just in their hearths, but in their hearts. When the Americans were gone, what remained was not just the food, or the warmth, or even the survival. It was something quieter, but stronger, the memory that mercy, once given, never truly leaves.